I'm going to start this first session on reception with a genuine speculation from the 7th century. And it's a speculation that about a potential buried city destroyed by an earthquake or an eruption in the, well, we're not quite sure of the date, but it is recorded in the 7th, 8th centuries. And here is the earliest manuscript of it. And you can get a sense of I'm going to talk about this manuscript a little bit in a minute. The speculation is based on an account of a prophecy fulfilled by the time it was recorded in Adam Nunn's Life of St. Columba. St. Columba, is this on?
It is, but when you move your head, if you just kind of slightly look around, it might be better.
Okay, all right, thanks very much. Recorded in Adam Nunn's Life of St. Columba. St. Columba is one of the founding saint of the monastery of Iona in the 6th century. It's one of the major monasteries of early British Christianity. The monks from Iona went very quickly to Holy Island in the northeast of Britain and travelled extensively into continental Europe. I'm going to talk about this manuscript in the first place, and I'm going to take you through 3 moments in the textual transmission of this prophecy that was fulfilled by the time the manuscript was written. I'm going to take you from Iona to Reichenau, and in the 8th century version of the life of this 6th century saint, that's Columba of Iona, who died around 597. The manuscript, the first manuscript, which I'll look at again in a minute, was as a compilation written by Cumina of Iona, Adamnan of Iona, and Dorberna of Iona. And it's Dorberna that is acknowledged in the earliest life of this manuscript. These are 3 abbot scribes from the 7th and 7th century. So this is a remarkable survival of a manuscript, and we'll look at that shortly. And then I'm going to take you from Reichenau to St. Gall. St. Gall, founded by an Irish hermit, and a later 9th century edited version of the life. It's a short version of the life of Columba based on the 7th, 8th century life. It's written in Carolingian minuscule, so it's not an Irish hand, but it is certainly a copy of the text, and it's from the 3rd quarter of the 9th century. And then I'm going to take you, stay in St. Gall for a 9th century, late 9th century, possibly early 10th century manuscript, a version, an account based on the earliest life of the same prophecy by Notker Balbulus, Notker the Stammerer, in his incomplete martyrology. So 3 moments, from Iona to Reichenau, from Reichenau to St. Gall, and at St. Gall. Reichenau and St. Gall are 2 of the most important monastic centres for learning in the early Middle Ages, and I think this is probably relevant. But first, let's have a look at Columba, and there he is. And this is an early image of him that's included in the St. Gall manuscript. It's very faded. I've enlarged it on the side here. You can just about see Columba here, and you can see a later 10th century Sanctus Columba here as well. This is in itself very unusual. You don't usually get portraits of saints in their saints' lives. It tells you something about how important it is. Here's the Schaffhausen manuscript now in Switzerland, but certainly in Reichenau in the Middle Ages. And I think I can show you here the name of the scribe in the colophon, Dorberna, Irish name, and in the St. Gall short edited version. This is quite important actually. This recorded in the 3rd quarter of the 9th century, lovely Carolingian manuscript hand, and it's been prepared probably for a study in the school text by omitting the Irish names, which are too complicated. I've already been murdering them, by the way. using a combination of Irish and anglicised Latin, in fact. So, why am I interested in this prophecy? I'm not the first one that was intrigued by this prophecy. I stand on that. There is a long tradition of scholars and monks going all the way back to the earliest manuscript who've been intrigued by this. First, I'm going to give you the chapter titles, that's the divisions, just to give you a sense of the consistency with which this prophecy is recorded. So the chapter titles from book 1, that's the first book of Adamnam's life, and it's the book of his prophecies, and it is regarding a city in the region of Rome, I guess, or Italy as it's often translated now, when fire fell from the heavens and destroyed people. This is also repeated in the chapter title for the division again in the red rubrication at the beginning of the account of the life. These rubrics are slightly later than the rest of the manuscript, so they're not that much later, but they've been added in. They say something about the importance of this first book of prophecies. Not sure quite what. And here's a summary of the prophecy itself. So a young monk by the name of Lugbe Mock Minu sees our saint, Columba, troubled, bright red in the face and visibly terrified. The witness says, "Why are you so scared?" And Columba replies, and is quoted as saying, I'll read the English, "In the past hour, sulphurous flames have poured out of heaven on a city under Roman jurisdiction within the borders of Italy, and nigh on 3,000 men have perished, not to mention women and children. Before this year ends, you will hear news of this from Gallic sailors travelling here from the province of Gaul, and they'll tell you the same thing." Virtually exactly the same account is recorded in the short edited version in Sangal from the 9th century. Okay, why on earth does this matter to you in this conference? What can we say about this textual evidence, and why is it important? I think it's important because of the specificity of the chapter titles. It's that city, Civitate, in Italy, in the region of Rome, or in the Roman regions, that keeps being repeated. It's important because this is a witness account. Witness accounts are incredibly significant for verifying historical oral narratives in the early Middle Ages. It's not unique to the life of St. Columba, but it's important. And Adamnan, at the beginning of his second preface to this life, goes out of his way to say, "I have used witness accounts because the law of Ireland specifies that oral reports are more important than textual ones." It's important too because of the specificity of the authority of the written account. These are 3 abbot scribes that are involved, author scribes that are involved in the production of this text. All of them based in Ireland. The manuscript was, in all likelihood, copied in Ireland. It's important because of the specificity of the early dates, the uniqueness of this manuscript, and the consistency of the 2 early versions. It's also important because it provides or is consistent with evidence of transmission from Iona through northern France into now modern Switzerland and Germany. Areas where, and I don't have time to demonstrate this today, but areas of particular interest in 3 Irish saints, Columba, Patrick and Bridget. And that interest focuses on Herculaneum and Constance and Sangal, from the 7th to the early 9th century. It's also important, and this is the third moment of the textual transition, because of Notker's summary of this in the 9th century. Notker, the stammerer of Sangal, I've already said, perhaps most important or best known for his work on music, early medieval music, and also for his account of one of the two earliest lives of Charlemagne. Notker records in his incomplete martyrology, which survives only in one manuscript, the deposition of Columba on June the 9th, which is the traditional date of the death of our saint. It's a Sangal manuscript, late 10th and early 11th century. It's important too because Notker knows something that is not referred to in the earlier lives. He calls Columba by his Irish name, Columcille, column of the church, in fact. And he's still known by that name in Ireland today. So Notker is drawing on other information. I will read the short extract that is very specific to this episode that he includes in his abbreviated martyrology. And this is the account of prophecy. He saw also the destruction of the city, which is now called Nova in Italy, the new city in Italy. He's in a sudden trance. It's an earthquake. No, it's a fire is pouring down from heavens. And it is reported to others in Ireland, and he predicted that sailors, merchant ships from Gaul would confirm this prophecy within the year. This is a normal trade route for the period. The Life's most recent translator, Richard Sharp, suggests intriguingly, and this is the speculation, that here we have a reference to Naples Bay, as an eruption in the Bay of Naples. This seems to be the most credible speculation so far. But he's also rigorous enough to say, and I'm going to say as well, I don't know if that's true, but there's a speculation about evidence there. And it intriguingly lines up with a reference in Paulus Diaconus's History of the Lombards, which reports a later eruption of Vesuvius in 685. Also, a manuscript copied in Sangal. Okay, at this point I'm just going to take a very quick break, not from the life of St. Columba, and move you back to the other text that Adamnan wrote in the 7th century, his better known, in fact, De Locis Sanctis, his historical geography of the holy places of Jerusalem. This was presented around 684 to Aldfrith, King of Northumbria, by Adamnan. It's earlier than the life of Columba, and it's presented as an account by a priest Arculf from Gaul. It's written in 3 books, exactly like the life of Columba. It has extensive early dissemination in continental Europe, including Reichenau, Salzburg, and it was later copied in Sangal. Just before the end of the final chapter, there is an account reported by Arculf to Adamnan about an eruption on Mount Vulcan, or volcano, which gives a sort of a thunder, burns fire, burns heavily, has earthquakes, burns more heavily, I love this, on a Friday or a Saturday, seen at night blazing, and is another eyewitness account. Now this isn't the Bay of Naples, we're in Sicily, but it is somewhat quite close to Etna. And it's certainly verified or drawn on by Gregory the Great, or draws on Gregory the Great's dialogues, where in another vision, which I've not got time to tell you about today, a vision of death is, prediction of death the narrative sees a boat sailing to Sicily, where there are more open pits burning with fires from hell than in other places. Gregory the Great's impetus at this point is to prove through historical geography and eruptions the reality of hell. But we don't have to I'm not going to pursue that much further. I'm more interested in the fact that our writer, Adamna, wrote 2 books, both of which include historical geography, references to earthquakes, eruptions, fires from heaven. So, what have we here? With apologies to Hugh Locke, amazing exhibition at the British Museum last year. What can we say, or what can I say, about this 6th century prophecy in early medieval Europe, a 7th century life, revised and reworked in the 9th century? What I can say, or what I can speculate, is that Columba's own saintly authority is authorizing extraordinary knowledge of historical events. I can also say that Adamna is particularly interested in witness accounts of the early history and geography of eruption in the life of St. Columba and in De Locis Sanctis. And we can probably speculate a little bit further and say he knows something about eruptions in the Bay of Naples, and he also knows a lot about Etna. Now, we can also say that, and here's another genuinely lost library, that on the evidence of the text produced at Iona, that he knew of Isidore's De Natura Rerum, Erosius's Historiae Adversus Paganos, and Gregory the Great's Dialogues, as well as a couple of early saints' lives. The 3 natural histories of those 3 texts, Isidore, and Erosius, and Gregory the Great, are 3 of the most important early medieval texts for knowledge and learning in the early medieval period. And they too have that reference to eruptions, including the AD 79 eruption and eruptions at Etna. I can also speculate, well, I can prove that there is evidence for interest in the life of St. Columba and De Locis Sanctis in Reichenau and St. Gall on the pilgrimage route to Rome, as I've already said. So this is a transmission of knowledge from 6th or 7th century Ireland all the way through to the 9th and 10th centuries. I can also suggest that Notker knew something of what was happening in the Bay of Naples, perhaps from Paulus Diaconus's History of the Lombards, yet another very important source of historical information in the period. Multiple manuscripts there. And it may well be associated with that bay in Naples. Now, I haven't said anything about Pliny's epistles, though they are copied in the 5th century in Italy, in Paris. I haven't said anything about Cassiodorus's Variae. Procopius's De Bello Gotico is too late in its manuscripts and is another tradition. It's from Byzantine, so I can't say something very much here today about those traditions, or Strabo, much later. But what I can, I think, do is at least use this speculation to reopen the question of what the early Middle Ages, Latin Middle Ages, knew of historic eruptions in the classical and through to the medieval, early Middle Ages. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you to Claire Lees, a really interesting speech about these early sources about Vesuvius and Herculaneum. And I will go to Carol Matouche now, speech, who studies ancient bronzes and more recently Herculaneum. Her books include classical bronzes, the art of craft and Greek and Roman statuary, the Villa dei Papiri at Herculaneum, Life and Art After Life of a Sculptor collection, and the exhibition catalogue Pompeii at the Roman Villa. And Today, she is speaking about before the papyri, publishing the earliest finds from Herculaneum.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak. Can you hear me? Good. Okay.
Trying to fill the screen. That's not it.
She added an empty slide, so it might be that. Just advance it one.
Move forward.
Here we go.
Is that your first slide?
Yes, that's the first slide.
That's your first one, okay.
Good. This is not about papyri. This is not about the Villa dei Papyri, found much later. This is about the earliest finds by the Spanish Bourbons in Herculaneum. But first, in 1709, a French cavalry commander who called himself the Prince d'Elbeuf, though it wasn't his real title, and who was employed by the Austrians ruling South Italy and Sicily, bought property at Granatello on the Bay of Naples, north of Portici. And you see in the middle of this slide, behind the railroad tracks, the villa that he built. From the bottom of a well shaft on his property, he dug outwards and he brought up antiquities. Among them, these fine marble statues of draped women, a larger one who was veiled, and two smaller ones which he quietly sent to Rome for repairs. One of the smaller ones had no head and needed a new one to be made for her. They ended up in Dresden with Augustus III, King of Poland and Elector of Saxony. In 1734, the Spanish Bourbons took over Naples and Sicily from the Austrians. And here you see the first king, Charles VII of Naples and Sicily, a son of Philip V of Spain and Elisabetta Farnese of Parma. Her family owned a fabulous collection of Roman antiquities. In 1738, Charles married Maria Amalia, the daughter of Augustus III, owner of the three ancient marble statues, which we know today as the Herculaneum women. Of that type, there are several hundred by now. Charles beautified the city of Naples, where, among other projects, he built the first opera house in Europe, took 6 months to build, a tremendous poorhouse, the Albergo dei Poveri, which is nearly 1,200 feet long, and several new palaces. Of interest to us is his palace at Portici, adjoining d'Elbeuf's former property at Granatello, on the outskirts of the modern town of Resina, and directly on top of Herculaneum, which ancient literary testimony are reported to have been named after Hercules, who built a town between Naples and Pompeii. In 1738 as well, Charles appointed the Spanish military engineer Joaquin de Alcubierre to survey his property and to direct an official excavation there. Here's one of the tunnels, early tunnels. This operation of his mirrored that of Delboeuf 20 years previously. From the bottom of vertical shafts, 70 or more feet deep, tunnels were dug outwards. And in the very first year, 1738, they found an inscription identifying the underground structure from which Delboeuf had gotten those marble women as the Theater of Herculaneum. Finding Herculaneum put the modern world directly in touch with the material remains of a lost ancient world that they had known previously from the literary testimony only. The fact that Herculaneum was deep underground added mystery. The finds would be a rich addition to the Bourbon collections, and of course Charles wanted to publish them. The first publication would include images of nearly 100 of the earliest finds. Most of them were small and apparently came from private houses near the theater. Charles's first attempt at publication was this magnificently bound and illustrated catalog of those earliest 100 finds, small ones. The project was directed by Jose Joaquin de Montealegre, the Secretary of State from 1738 to 1746. In 1746, this large folio volume appeared. It's about 19 inches tall. A Moroccan leather cover embellished with a Bourbon insignia coat of arms. The title, Copper Engravings of the Ancient Paintings Found in the Excavations at Resina, is, as you can see, somewhat misleading. Resina? By 1746, when that title page was dated, the name of the ancient site of Herculaneum beneath Resina had been known for 8 years. So when did they print the title page? Plus, the title states that the book is about ancient paintings, but half of the catalog is about bronze statuettes, lamps, marble sculptures, and marble reliefs, all mixed up together. 10 pages list the items illustrated in the following 90 plates. Was the title page printed first before the illustrations had been submitted? Here's one of the pages of the entries. Who wrote these entries? Was it Montealegre himself? They are in no apparent order, that is marble, bronze, and so forth, and they do not tell us the medium, the measurements, the condition, or the fine spot. Another bit of a problem. Then come the illustrations. These objects, some of them, like these, getting a full page, others in groups. Two-dimensional objects like these are pretty accurately represented, I think. But where do they come from? This one on the left I don't recognize, nor the one on the right. Quite a few frescoes are of individual figures. Some, like these heads, come from different walls of the same room and were mounted together. Now, look at the bunny. Is that a painting or a relief? I think it's a relief. Are three-dimensional objects bronze or marble? Very hard to track down the objects without more information. Two artists, uncredited, have been identified Antonio Sebastiani and Clemente Ruta. The names of the engravers appear in the lower right corner of most of the numbered plates, but not all of them. Francesco Sassoni, Francesco Ciaparulli, and a few by Pierre-Jacques Gaultier. Counting Monte Alegre, it looks as if 6 people were involved in preparing the catalog and not counting production. How big is Zeus? We wonder what the colors were. Is that a rainbow? Fortunately, the painting is on exhibit, so we can figure it out. In the Campania exhibition in the Museo Nazionale in Naples. The fresco is big. It's about 80 by 138 centimeters, and that is a rainbow. But it's interesting, this has been published 3 or 4 times, and each time the measurements that are given are totally different. So I just picked one and hope it's about correct. Returning to some statuettes, most of the works illustrated in the disegni are small. These are bronze statuettes. A lot of them are not on display. You'll see why not. It's been hard to find them, and I haven't yet found all of them. The marbles, I haven't found most of them, like this Herm, Janiform Herm. Fortunately, it seems that all but a couple of the objects in this book are still in Naples, but not this one. This large bronze statuette, about 66 centimeters tall, went to France as part of the negotiations allowing Ferdinand, Charles's son, to return to rule Naples after being ousted by the French in 1798. The statuette has been in the Louvre since 1825. Most of the entries briefly describe the figures and their condition, but this one goes a little further. Part of it reads, an armored warrior with mantle riding a charger at full gallop without a bridle, like Curtius, who's about to fling himself into the abyss. On his head a helmet with extended plumes representing the sun, and his right arm raised, though missing the hand. He is in the act of regarding the nearby abyss. Really? This is total fabrication. How to show an object and what to say about it seems to have been left up to the people who did the pictures and the text. They always showed which parts were missing. In this case, a bridle, the hand, the horse's tail, but a shadow is being added, as well as some ground beneath the horse and a little grass, as if the horse is 3-dimensional. In later publications, this and other damaged figures are completed. This little bronze horseman reappears 25 years later in volume 6 of the 8-volume publication, De Antiquitate Herculano. But it's only a headpiece for an unrelated entry, and it's unidentified, and it is fully restored. But the back is hollow, and now we know that this is one of the appliques from the breast collars of bronze horses hitched to a bronze chariot. There are charging cavalrymen, charging and fallen barbarian enemies, and galloping horses. They are all of them no more than about 10 centimeters tall. The chariot itself is in pieces. Here's an Aphrodite, perhaps from a lararium in a home. What was the artist to do? With the spooled base, it's only about 17 centimeters tall, or less than 7 inches. It is not a great work to begin with, and corrosion mars the surface even more. The artist felt, I guess, that he had to improve it, inventing facial details adding fingers and toes and a little more flesh. But he omitted the spooled base, and sometimes, often, this ancient base has helped me very much to identify a statuette. Take this one, illustrated in the disegno. It says, a torso of a man lacking from the knees down, the left arm to the elbow, and the right arm to below the shoulder. The hair is wound round the head, and the beard divides into 4 parts that fall to points, 3 of which are visible. The head is inclined. Great description, right? That text in the disegno overlooks the fact, though, that this is a sculpture of a nude, and that the body shows a fine S-curve. The size, again, is a mystery. In the illustration, he has a shadow, 2 shadows on both sides of him, so we can figure out that he may be 3-dimensional. And what a beauty, isn't it? What's he made of? The next time the statue was drawn and engraved was about 50 years later. He is fully restored, leans on a tree trunk, which means he's marble. There is a scale beneath the engraving, making him as a whole a little over 1 meter tall. The marbles from Herculaneum and the other sites on the Bay of Naples were never published in a volume, so this is one of the unedited illustrations. Now get ready. The statue. I first saw the statue in 2018. Some of the restorations have been removed. Other parts were added that were found separately. Who'd have known? There is a hole for insertion of a tail. And what's new? Not the base. It is mentioned in the diary of Alcubierre. So far as we know, only 3 full copies of the disegno were printed and bound. 3. Charles would have sent 1 copy to his mother, Elisabetta Farnese, in Madrid in 1746, when Monte Allegro returned to Spain. Anyhow, 1 of those 3 copies is in Madrid. Another ended up in the Victorian Albert, and the 3rd is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Some loose pages are in Dresden. Why are there only 3 printed and bound copies of the disegno? What was wrong? I think we've seen some of the things from today's standpoint. Plenty was wrong. It's haphazardly organized. The objects are barely described. The illustrations unreliable. Charles must have thought so too. What's more, the volume was almost all about small finds, small paintings which were in good condition, a few marble plaques and oscilla, bronze attachments, bronze statuettes. When this was published in 1746, Charles also had much larger finds, in particular frescoes, and many more of them to publish. Here's what happened next. In 1749, Charles formed the Royal Publishing House, the Regia Stamperia. In 1754, Prime Minister Fogliani's cousin, Ottavio Antonio Baiardi, published a catalog of the ancient monuments unearthed in Herculaneum, with descriptions of nearly 3,000 works arranged by type, paintings, bronze and marble statues, bronze vases, etc. It wasn't illustrated. But nonetheless, 1,700 copies were printed. In the next year, 1755, Charles hired a new prime minister, Bernardo Tanucci. They enlisted together 15 top scholars to form a committee to study the finds from the Bourbon excavations around the Bay of Naples and publish them. And they hired 25 illustrators and engravers. The new series, the Antiquità di Herculano, eventually had 8 magnificent folio volumes, 5 on paintings, 2 on bronzes, and 1 on lamps and candelabra. The first published in 1757, the last in 1792. Notice there isn't one on marbles. Camillo Paderni, the director of the Museum Herculanese, designed this portrait of Charles, the frontispiece for all but one of the volumes of the Antiquità. The last one had his son, Ferdinand. Footnotes, as you can see, are extensive. This is not one of the larger footnotes at the bottom of the page. Sometimes they take up all but about 2 lines. So the footnotes are extensive. There's a great deal about mythology included. A number of items that appeared in the Disegni were republished in the Antiquità with new illustrations, most of them serving only as headpieces or tailpieces. But some were cataloged, like this one. Some of the paintings, this is a painting, but a fairly small one. The print run for the first volume of the Antiquità was 2,100 copies. Each volume was highly sought after. So I have told you now a little bit about the first publication. Only 3 bound copies so far as I know. Tell me if you know of more. But it's a fascinating project. And to see the kinds of things that they were finding, which were, they thought, ready for publication, is really interesting. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to Carol Matusz, who really interested us, fascinated us with this strange edition of a kind of prequel of the Antiquità di Herculano, which is really, really interesting. And so we went to our last speaker of this section, Noah Helga, who teaches English at University of Missouri, USA. He has published books and articles on Romanticism and science, as well as a digital edition of the antiquarian print series, Vetusta Monumental. He is currently at work on a selected English edition of Letters of Joachim Winckelmann. I wanted just to say something to the audience. We decided to present the questions for the end of the section. So at the end of Professor Helga's speech, you will be, every one of us, every speaker will be here, and so there will be a little space for your questions.
I'll be returning again to Vesuvius in this talk, so I'll make sure to keep cool. Thank you, Maria. Many thanks to Maria and to Bob for their hospitality. Very happy to be here, and it's an honor to share this podium today with a number of scholars whose work has meant so much to me. And I'm an 18th century scholar, and one of my concerns in talking to you about Winkelmann today is the topos of Herculaneum as a portal to the past. But I have to say that yesterday's sessions made me understand it instead as a portal to the future, as I watched the 20 meters of ash and rubble disappear from the surface of Herculaneum, and the interior of the papyri revealed. All of that brought to the light. It was quite amazing, but I'm now comfortable, more comfortable again. Back in the 18th century, Joachim Winkelmann, the pioneering art historian and polymath, was a friend of Herculaneum, and so perhaps needs no further introduction here. But as Maria said, I'm working on an English edition of his letters, so I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to engage more closely with his writings about Herculaneum and Naples in particular, both published and unpublished, which are ultimately very central to the corpus of the letters as a whole. So let's have a look at him. There he is, depicted around the time of his third visit to Naples. Winkelmann visited Naples and surrounding archaeological sites 4 times between February 1758 and November 1767. After the second visit in 1762, he published his 100-page letter on the Herculanean discoveries, which did much to establish his reputation. And step away from the mic, just let me know if I disappear from your ears. And paved the way for the success of his History of Ancient Art, 1764. He had access to one group of marbles, which we've now seen thanks to Carol's presentation, the Herculaneum women, before he left Germany, and his first-hand knowledge of these works provided support for the argument of his first book, The Reflections on the Imitation of the Greeks, in 1755. So in a way, I'm sort of picking up the story right where Carol left off. Having surveyed the finds from Herculaneum and a few from Pompeii in his 1762 letter, Winkelmann then developed sustained interpretations of some of these sculptures and wall paintings. In his history, interpretations promised or advertised in the text of the letter itself. These well-known facts might seem to support a linear narrative of Winkelmann's increasing exposure to, pardon me, an understanding of Greco-Roman monuments, not securely datable as he acknowledged, but all the same a strong foundation for his influential history regard. But the narratorial personae of the published works, as compelling as they are, tell only part of the story. And scores of familiar letters, published only after his death, Winkelmann produces lively accounts of each of the 4 site visits, adapting a much wider range of perspectives and personae. On the occasion of his first visit in 1758, he develops the figure of the client as a friend and social equal. Next, the master of role-playing and disguise, more candid than the narrator of the published epistle. Next, the impassioned pedagogue as friend, also reflected in the dedication to Winkelmann's sequel of 1764, a report on the latest discoveries. And finally, the mythologized vision of himself as a cyclops on the burning mountain, disseminated in familiar letters written in 1767 when his visit happened to coincide with an eruption of Vesuvius. This repertoire demonstrates the importance of self-fashioning for Winkelmann's scholarly project. And I'll approach it here as a stylistic analog of the metonymy so central to Winkelmann's thought, which renders Herculaneum a proxy for ancient Greeks. Planned voyages to Greece and to Sicily, another sort of proxy, make frequent appearances in Winkelmann's familiar letters, though none of these voyages ever came to fruition. Both destinations are mentioned as early as 1756, sometimes in connection with the Kingdom of Naples. Discussion of a Sicilian voyage that almost came to pass coincides with Winkelmann's accounts of his last journey to Naples, because he intended to set out from there that autumn with Johann Hermann Vitése, the pupil and proxy voyager who had already reconnoitered key Sicilian sites on Winkelmann's behalf. He had a long-standing interest in the Doric temples at Agrigentum as monuments perhaps more directly connected with classical Greece than those of Herculaneum. Winkelmann does include Herculanean monuments in the account of Greek painting and sculpture in his history of ancient art. But, quote, though their styles appear to be Greek, as Carol Matouche notes, he rarely committed himself to specific styles or dates. Winkelmann's suggestive reasoning by proxy has long been associated with the figure of the maid on the shore, an Ariadne-like role assumed by the narrator of the history near the end of the book as he gazes longingly into the distant past of an art that is unreachable now, like a ship that has sailed. As Catherine Harlow has shown, this Ovidian figure may be traced to the Heroides, which Winkelmann was alluding to in his letters as early as 1746. Winkelmann's repertoire of personae, enriched by hundreds of surviving letters, confirms this emphasis on unbridgeable distance in some cases, but also includes contrasting figures of living antiquity and embodied pleasure, such as the Cyclops of Vesuvius. Although surviving monuments may be in the end a poor substitute for the art of antiquity, antiquity can be brought nearer through a variety of figures and techniques focalized by these personae, including autopsy, original scholarship, social freedom, and heroic friendship. Winkelmann's letters show that he was eager to visit Herculaneum almost as soon as he arrived in Rome in 1755 from Dresden. But financing the trip posed a challenge, and at first his living in Rome was precarious. By the beginning of 1758, his stipend from the Saxon court was coming regularly, and he had accepted an additional travel subsidy from his patron, Cardinal Atinto, albeit reluctantly, as he claimed in a letter to his old friend Hieronymus Dietrich Berendes in February 1758. This letter details his extensive preparations for a trip that he hoped would make his fortune, as he confided to Berendes, calling it, quote, the most important undertaking of my life. The funding proved adequate, hinlänglich, as he predicted in his letter, and the numerous letters of recommendation that preceded him smoothed the way for 2.5 very productive months at Naples, Portici, Herculaneum, and elsewhere. All the same, Winkelmann was delighted to find in April, near the end of his visit, that his fundraising efforts had met with another success. The Paris-based German printmaker Johann Georg Wilhelm, hearing of his plans, took up a collection among his connections in the art and publishing world. One of these colleagues, Johann Caspar Füssli in Zurich, soon became a regular correspondent of Winkelmann's, along with other supporters from that city, and his many letters to them formed the basis of an important volume published 10 years after Winkelmann's death, Winkelmann's letters to his friends in Switzerland. I'll be quoting extensively from the letters because I'd like you to get the sound of them in your ear, and the many voices that Winkelmann adopts in these letters. And more selfishly, I'm also interested in any corrections and comments you might have about the translation, since that's my focus, is getting these wonderful letters into English. Winkelmann's letters show that he was eager to visit, lost my place. His first letter to Füssli, this is what you're seeing here, at that point a benefactor, but a complete stranger, builds on the trope of heroic friendship that informs many of Winkelmann's letters in this period. This world becomes my Eden, and life becomes bliss through an acquaintance with men of the highest order, like my Füssli. I would willingly undergo great tribulations to know such a friend face to face. Meanwhile, I paint his portrait in my mind, and I create him in the image of all that is most beautiful and venerable in the world, so I can hold out my hands to him. Winkelmann understood Füssli's gesture as an act of generosity by a fellow humanist and artist inspired by a shared passion for the arts of antiquity, without any expectation of return. He reciprocates this offer of heroic friendship with a richly textured image that evokes God's creation of Adam, Pygmalion's creation of Galatea, and perhaps the origin of painting as well. Face-to-face contact, as in several of Winkelmann's epistolary friendships, becomes endlessly deferred, although he did finally have concrete plans to visit the time of his death. Although he was clearly dependent on patronage and royal favor during his time in Naples, Winkelmann pursued friendship there as an avenue toward social freedom, which was at the same time a freedom to move through the aesthetic and imaginative space of ancient art. In the public-facing letter of 1762, he acknowledged in print the generosity of the Neapolitan intellectuals who had offered him friendship and hospitality, especially Antonio Piaggio and Giovanni Maria della Torre, negotiating with the government of Charles VII of Naples and with the Herculaneum Academy, whom we just met at the end of Carol's talk, was another matter. Winkelmann was very candid about the extent of the deception he practiced as an archaeological spy, in spite of his formal promise, which is still on record, to honor the king's embargo on any publication of the finds outside the kingdom. Some of this became apparent in the published letter, but writing to Berendis just after his return to Rome, Winkelmann is especially glib about his willingness to assume any role he needed to play in order to gain access to the antiquities. With the superintendent of the museum, this is Baderni, the confidant of the queen, who was a great deceiver, an arch ignoramus, and instigated attacks on me before I even arrived. I played the role of the simpleton. I assumed humility among the scholars, presented myself as truthful and upright with the prime minister, Marchese Tanucci, a proud and learned man. Winkelmann goes on to say that he secured the queen's favor through a kind of reverse psychology by refusing to ask for anything. This might be one of those places where we might not want to trust his own account of himself 100%. He then concedes that he often gained access by sneaking around like a thief, wie ein schleichender Dieb, throughout the time of his visit. All these performances brought antiquity nearer in its material forms, as intellectual property, and as the culminating body of evidence that he needed to complete his history of ancient art, which he presents here as already imminent, and to assume the coveted role of authorship. Though brimming with enthusiasm, this letter implicitly acknowledges the obstacles that still stand in the way of Winkelmann's approach to antiquity. Tone changes, however, when he narrates his encounter with the ruins at Pesta, the goal of the longest excursion that Winkelmann undertook from Naples. And I'm still dwelling with the letter of 15 May 1758 to Berendis, which is a very valuable document, very thorough in its account of that first visit. He declares this exceptionally well-preserved and seldom seen Doric temple complex to be much older than anything in Greece. Viel älter als alles, was in Griechenland is. And it holds out the promise of more immediate access to Greek antiquity than even Herculaneum could offer. In this letter, Winkelmann first formulates his plan to travel through the kingdom of Naples on foot in search of more forgotten remains of the same age. Once this plan is given up in 1760, he concentrates more and more on the idea of shipping out to Sicily following one of his visits to Naples, believing that here too he would find something more than a proxy for classical Athens. When Winkelmann returned to Naples in January 1762, he stayed only 1 month. But the groundwork he had done enabled him to use the time efficiently. In addition to the public-facing epistle, which was published later that year, he once again reported his findings in many familiar letters, emphasizing the wealth of new discoveries since 1758. This time, he managed to amass many pages of field notes in spite of the need for secrecy. These notes, many of which are still preserved in Paris, are first mentioned in a letter to Winkelmann's Swiss friend, Leonhard Ustri, in which he also places a special emphasis on 4 new frescoes discovered in 1761, already cut out in the wall, leading him to imagine that they might have been imported from Greece. Stylistic criteria, however, provide the primary basis for his judgment here that, quote, these paintings alone are worthy of a Greek pencil and a great painter. A judgment fully elaborated in a long passage on these same works in a chapter on Greek painting in the history of ancient art, where he guesses at their subjects, including Achilles and Patroclus in this particular case. Writing to the sculptor Johannes Wiedewelt 2 weeks later, he develops this thesis of Greek originality and adds this time he was able to visit all the excavations unaccompanied, touching on all 5 buried cities. Writing on the same day to J.J. Volkmann, who had gone to Paestum with him in 1758, Winkelmann returns to the notion that the newly discovered paintings would allow him to finish his book, something we all want to do. This long letter, too, is especially frank about the sheer difficulty of writing works based on autopsy and continually expanding discoveries. It's a wonderful piece of authorial representation. I could now give a very particular report on the discoveries of Herculaneum, but I lack the time, and I only have one hand, where other authors have at least assistance in copying. This makes my work very difficult. How often have I transcribed the history of art? And how many piles of draft material? These birth pangs notwithstanding, the letter on the Herculaneum discoveries was in print by the end of the year, and once again the familiar letters offer insight into the process of Winkelmann's work, including the early reception of his Endschreiben by Ustri, one of his favored readers. Responding to Ustri's playful insinuation that he had written too passionately about the bronze Mercury in the Villa of Piri, Winkelmann concedes that the scarcity of such bronzes might account for some of his emphasis on its beauty. It is a mere Mercury, after all, not an Apollo. All the same, he insists, if the Mercury had heated my imagination, I would not have passed up the opportunity to treat it poetically. For I assure you that I sought the opportunity to compose something in this vein. If my friend in Portici weren't keeping such a sharp eye on me, I could have said more that was useful, but he noticed that I was right. I can't express how much trouble it cost me to see the ground plan of subterranean work, and I'm certain this is Viva's plan as discussed by Carol in her wonderful edition. And I'm certain that I'm the only one who has succeeded in doing so. Like the published text, this passage highlights autopsy as a core of Winkelmann's method, and at the same time insists on his intellectual priority as a discoverer. Both of these topoi may be traced across the published and unpublished writings, underscoring the immediacy, authenticity he pursued in seeking out better and better proxies, or type specimens. The published Endschreiben also includes carefully observed details of natural history, including evidence of changing sea levels and the volcanic poisoning of a grove of elm trees that was still thriving at the time of his first visit in 1758. The Endschreiben, too, engages in a polemical defense of Winkelmann's empirical rigor, twice employing a mixed metaphor to set his own attentiveness apart from that of others, and citing, was der handgreifliche Augenschein zeigt, literally as shown by tangible, visible evidence, or the obvious truth of appearance. As Alex Potts showed so well in Flesh and the Ideal, Winkelmann reflected constantly on the limits of empirical approaches to ancient art, and this oddly tautological coinage, together with more skeptical passages in the letters, demonstrates this self-awareness. His letters around this time, around the time of the second visit to Naples, also showed him reflecting increasingly on the status of Herculaneum as an imperfect proxy for Greece, to which he returned partly because other destinations proved unreachable. His biography, Carl Justi, observes that Winkelmann came to think of Naples as, quote, only a stage on the way to further voyages of discovery, even as it became, in fact, his primary destination, alongside Rome. When he returned for another month in 1764, there were many more new discoveries to report, leading to the publication of a sequel. The report also included in Carol Matouche's wonderful English edition and translated by her for the first time. The familiar letters describing this visit place a new emphasis on Winkelmann's role there as a pedagogue, a guide, and a boon companion. The latter persona prevails in this May 1764 letter to Berendus, containing what may be his most laconic account of a visit to Naples. Before Easter, I spent 4 weeks on my third visit to Naples, where I amused myself, not a little. And I am now expecting half a barrel of Lagriman for myself, in which your health will be drunk with pleasant company. For you must know that I have learned to give elegant dinners from time to time. His letter to Vita later that month does mention the discoveries, including the Street of Tombs and the Herculaneum Gate, Pompeii, as well as the second mosaic by Dioscorides of Samos, which he writes was discovered in his presence. But he also exclaims again what a lark it was. Ich bin niemals lustiger gewesen. Part of the pleasure was owing to Winkelmann's companion on this trip, Johann Heinrich Füssli. Johann Heinrich Füssli, not to be confused with the Anglo-Swiss painter who was this Füssli's cousin and namesake. Winkelmann dedicated the report to Füssli. and then wrote to him explaining why he did not choose epistolary form for this text. I had begun to draft a dedicatory epistle on the usefulness of revisiting Rome after returning to the fatherland. But since I am unable to write coldly to my friends and would have expressed more devotion than one is accustomed to hear, to feel, and to read, I broke it off, so as not to start rumors about myself in print. Instead of writing with such warmth, Winckelmann contents himself with a simple dedication, but the letters reveal that the Campanian sites became interwoven with his ideals of pedagogy and friendship. He did, however, experience, there you can see the dedication to Fuseli. He did experience coldness, however, from the Neapolitan authorities, beginning with a snub by Tanucci that he described in a letter to Ustri as un-Italian, in the sense that it punctured the illusion of social equality among antiquaries, which he regarded as a survival of ancient manners in Italy. The tension came to a head when his Sendschreiben became public knowledge after his departure by a French translation, and a polemical reply to it was published in Naples in 1765. All the same, Winckelmann could not keep himself away from Naples. When preparing his fourth visit in the autumn of 1767, he represented it again as a stage on a longer journey to Sicily, which Witteser had reconnoitered for him in the spring of that year. As he explained in a letter to Paulus, 8 August, in order to serve you Zurichers continually with new reports, I am already anointing my feet, bent and wrinkled though I am from work, for a voyage to Sicily in the company of a draftsman, in order to, sorry about that, there we are, in the company of a draftsman, in order to select the most difficult of the 700 painted vessels at Catania and have them recorded. And this is one of those from the Biscari collection. This was one of the unrealized projects. This was something that Winckelmann had very carefully planned out near the end of his life. Accepting the hospitality of the shady Baron Alcavia in Naples would be part of the opportunity cost. The Sicilian expedition had to be canceled after a Rome visit by several heads of state was announced for November. Instead, Winckelmann spent 2 months in Naples mending fences and regaining access to the royal collections with such success that he was in a position to promise Ustri a second sequel to the letter on Herculaneum, to be written in French this time. Summing up these 2 months of intense activity in a letter to his former colleague in the library at Witnitz, he reports that he visited Portici 20 times and Pompeii 4 times, along with numerous other sites in the region. This letter, however, enlarges on a new and unexpected manifestation of antiquity, the eruption of Vesuvius, 20 October 1767, on which Winckelmann planned to report in his new sequel. Those who have not actually seen this sublime spectacle can have no concept of it. Eyewitness accounts, again, we're back to the importance of that. I spent an entire night on the mountain itself in the company of my own Baron Witteser and a famous adventurer, Alcavia. We roasted pigeons on the fiery stream with Winckelmann, like the Cyclopes, took his evening meal naked. Throughout his brief archaeological career, Winckelmann consistently cited literary and philological motives. He often explained his use of ancient objects to gloss and clarify numerous passages in ancient writers, using his idiosyncratic term for a writer's event, to unite ancient and modern writing in one humanistic trajectory. His symposium on the Burning Mountain, narrated with such pleasure, captures a moment of living antiquity brought near by the meta-historical chronology of the volcano. It also creates an intertext, weaving together Witteser's recent account of Etna and Cyclopean imagery documented by Witteser and by Winckelmann himself, who revisited Homer's Polyphemus and his gloss on this ancient relief in his Monumenti Antiquienti, 1767. His exchanges with Witteser allude to other versions of this character, in Theocritus, Virgil, Ovid, and it may be Polyphemus, the lover of Galatea, who presides over the three antiquaries' picnic on Vesuvius. The Cyclopes' affinity for volcanoes is worthy of much closer investigation. Suffice it to say that Winckelmann's image invokes the agency of Vesuvius, which created Herculaneum, Pompeii, as portals to the ancient past, and so made possible the many approaches to antiquity embodied in Winckelmann's epistolary personae: the passionate friend, the respected original scholar, the master impersonator, the questing voyager, and the feasting cyclops. Thank you.
Welcome back to the afternoon paper session. And I would like to remind the speakers yet again, please put your mouth very close to the microphone so that everyone can hear you. Can you hear me, by the way? Yes, good, thank you. Let's see if we can get the first paper shown here. Don't know. How do we switch from this one to up? There we go. Thank you, Maria. Now let me introduce you. Maria Toscano has taught about museums and has been a research fellow in modern history in Naples. Since 2021, she's been an associate fellow at the Warburg Institute. She's working on projects with the European Translator Database, with CRES, the Centro di Ricerca Epistolare del Settecento, at the University of Verona, and ISPF, the Istituto per la Storia del Pensiero Filosofico e Scientifico of the Centro Nazionale per le Ricerche. Welcome, and we look forward to your paper on the modern approach and the study of the remains of ancient Vesuvian cities.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and I will take the chance to thank in particular each of the speaker for accepting our invite here, and let me thank in particular Alain Schnapp, because not just for coming here today, but also because to him I owe, honestly, the most part of my cornerstone of my researches. So, back in 2004, reconstructing the lives and collecting practice of the cosmopolitan intellectual environment that acted in Naples around the figure of William Hamilton, I defined the concept of antiquarian naturalism, a very specific enlightenment mentality that had an interest in natural and pre-human history, antiquity and anthropology as a part of the whole history of the world. I later dedicated my book, Gli Archivi del Mondo, to this concept. In this second phase of my studies, I dedicated myself instead to reconstruction of theoretical premises that inspired and the cultural roots, mainly Masonic and academic, along which it came on defining itself and spreading throughout Europe, and especially in the Anglo-Italian context. To be able to understand why did they research and exactly what. My speech today will be dedicated specifically to the synthetic exposition to the so-called anima mundi, a concept of Platonic and Pythagorean origin that refers to a theistic and totalizing vision of nature, in which lays the very starting point and the core of this mentality at the same time, and undoubtedly represents its longest lasting legacy. I will try to demonstrate the imperatives In particular, how this specific idea of nature was has influenced the episteme, the practice, and the topics of some of the most representative personalities among those interested in historical events of Herculaneum and Pompeii between 18th and early 19th century. We will see how during the second half of 18th century, this mentality experienced a decisive phase of growth and diffusion in Italy between Rome and Naples. But this passage, although essential, is often misrecognized and misunderstood, and certainly awaits to be investigated in detail. In particular, the fervent scientific environment of Collegio Nazareno in Rome and lively Neapolitan cultural world, supported by Bourbon court until the revolutionary crisis at the end of the century, offered an essential contribution to ideological and epistemological definition of this idea of nature and of this practice. The roots and the relationship between Naples and London in the field of natural philosophy are deep and strong. In 1732, still during the Austrian viceroyalty, Celestino Galiani, Bartolomeo Intieri, and Francesco Serao established the Accademia delle Scienze di Napoli to create the local Royal Society. This group was part of the entourage of Giambattista Vico, already in contact with some of the most important Royal Society's members, and with Newton himself, who received and appreciated the first edition of La Scienza Nuova, the main Vico's text. From 1759 to 1790, the Kingdom of Naples knew a real political golden age, thanks to Ferdinando himself and his wife Maria Carolina, daughter of Maria Teresa d'Austria. In those years, the interaction between court and intellectual was intense, even if not successfully in any case. The reform of university and the foundation of royal academies represented the first attempt to radically renew the culture of the kingdom. Science and humanities, forwarded by Genovese and his numerous pupils, were free from any theoretical constriction, centered on senses and visual data, based on a strongly inductive method. The first and more evident signals of this Neapolitan effervescence, as Alain Schnapp beautifully defined it, happened in antiquarian studies and the related editorial productions. Obviously, for a couple of decades, the obsolete bookish and autoreferential erudition and this new concept of making history based on observation and comparison of natural and cultural phenomena, understood as a sequence of events to be explained by a single paradigm, coexisted. In 1755, Martorelli could still produce the Regia Teca Calamaria, 2 volumes, and over 800 pages of boring erudition in which a bomb pot is identified as an ink pot. In the same year, Alessio Simmaco Mazzocchi produced the innovative exegesis of Commentari Regi ad Herculanensis Musei Aeneas Tabulas Heraclenses. Obviously, this comparative approach particularly fits the studies on the object emerging by excavation of Herculaneum and then Pompeii. In 1755 was found the Accademia Herculanense, among its members Alessio Simmaco Mazzocchi and Ferdinando Galliani. Significantly, Martorelli was excluded, was not in. From 1757 to 1792 were published Le Antichità di Herculaneum Esposte, 8 sumptuously illustrated volumes reproducing what emerged by the excavation, both artworks and everyday life objects, exposed in the Museo Herculanense di Portici, a very modern idea of collection of antiquities, and quite unique in many senses, created ad hoc, starting from a broad idea of sources, preferably tangible, it arrives at an equally broad idea of memorabilia, which included the reconstruction of the cultural world, religion, popular traditions, and daily life of the Roman past. Among the first and closest Hamilton's friends, Domenico Tata and Francesco Daniele, represent also two of the earliest and best exponents of this new antiquarian practice. Tata, in particular, best expressed how each aspect of war and its history are complementary and caused by the hand of God, referring more to a force operating in the world, making its history, whose laws are to be understood, rather than to a still deity to venerate, detached from it. Francesco Daniele was a passionate reader and admirer of Vico. He was appointed royal historiographer thanks to his interest in local history. His best book, Le Forche Caudine Illustrate, is a beautiful infolio equipped with a magnificent engravings. Daniele, in essence, tries to locate the Forche Caudine theater of the famous battle between Rome and Samnites. To reach this conclusion, he makes a critical reading of the ancient sources relating to the event, but at the same time, he subjects them to the comparison with the current orography of the territory, taking into account the nature of rocks and therefore the changes that the landscape had undergone over time. Throughout the text, Daniele shows full awareness of the novelty and usefulness of the operation conducted by him. His book was a huge echo, as Hamilton's works. Not just Effeméridi Letterarie di Roma, a journal which in those years represented the voice of this entourage, but a number of journals all over Europe praised him, underlining many times how using material sources and naturalistic argument in an antiquarian text provided additional information and led to more certain results. This new idea of studies of antiquities had taken place at least nearly a decade before Hamilton arrives in Naples in 1764. The British diplomat had just a vague interest in collecting art pieces, mainly paintings, to be honest, in the spirit of the 17th century amateur. But just a few years later, in 1767, he published the famous 4 volumes of Greek and Roman antiquities. A Sumptuous edition with the infolio depicted engravings in the vases coming from his first collection. In fact, the book was not a volume to enhance the study of antiquities, but mostly a way to show the beauty of Hamilton's first collection of vases, and an invite of the newborn British Museum to acquire it, and he succeeded. The images are accompanied by long and sometimes obscure comment of the Baron d'Incarville. He wrote in a fascinating style and formulated some genial hypotheses, but this text is the opposite of rigor and order. Descriptions are not description on any sense, but long digressions. The whole edition recalls far more closely the Regia Teca Calamaria than the works by Mazzocchi or the Le Antichità di Herculaneum. By the way, in Naples, another famous collection of vases, the Mastrilli one, has been already reproduced and commented in a far more agile style since 1755, and it was a collection coming from Nola, a city that Hamilton knew very well because he visited it several times and also made personal excavation there. So Hamilton himself must be aware of the inadequacy of his first antiquarian work. In fact, the publication of his second basis collection, the collection of engravings, followed other criteria as the brevity of comments, probably say description, to whom corresponded far more synthetic figurative reproduction, accurate but essential, commissioned to Tischbein, an artist very learned in antiquities and natural history, expert executor of illustration with a preeminent scientific aim. It was no more about provoke fascination, wonder, mystery, but induce the opposite, understand why those bases were made for, through the image painted on them, reconstruct rites and myths of the antique society, and in few unveil the true history. So, a lot has changed, but during the nearly 20 years passing between his first and his second antiquarian book, The Nobleman, had made to be influenced by and being a proper scientific collaboration with some of the most important naturalists and antiquarianists of the already existing Neapolitan and Roman entourages, Alberto Fortis, Gianvincenzo Petrini, Scipione Preslac, Gaetano De Botis, Ascanio Filomarino della Torre, Giovanni Maria della Torre, those people, acting in and around Vesuvius since the mid-18th century, knew very well who theories, and following Boulanger, they were men of action and of observation against abstract proposition and theoretical consideration. That's why they decided to obey to Buffon's call to arm to try and produce a history of art using the methods of antiquarianists. That mentality led a place like Naples to be the ideal place for those kind of studies. That's why right there, between the 60s and 19th of 18th century, studies of antiquities and natural history completely overlap. Once aware of the Neapolitan intellectual climate, for Hamilton, collect was not enough. He began to excavate personally the antiquities, to bring an artist with him, to reproduce his finding, and also the context and the way they have been uncovered. Collection of engravings is the last and definitely the most beautiful product of Hamilton's antiquarian interest, but it was not the best. Long before, while he was at work on Campi Flegrei, he had sent a memoir to Royal Society called Account of a Discovery at Pompeii, in which archaeological and geological observations are really industrially linked, and all serve to reconstruct the everyday life and the last moment of Pompeii's inhabitants, and to make hypotheses about the kind of catastrophe that destroyed those ancient cities at the same time. He uses the visual data with the task to explain, demonstrate, divulgate, comparison of sources, chronological evidences, naturalistic observation of the landscape, and its reproduction as a part of understanding are in fact part of a praxis, a single strategy of analysis to make history on the field. The key words for this special method were truth and curiosity in the Baconian sense, as the will to constantly gain and enlarge knowledge. So it is definitely not true that Hamilton arriving in Naples brought a new approach to history and natural history, because he learned and absorbed a lot from what was already going on in town, both in archaeological and geological studies. He found peer interlocutors with whom confront and grow. But it's definitely true that Hamilton in Naples marked the starting point toward the constitution of an international intellectual entourage, conscious of itself and aware of having determined a clear discontinuity with the practice of investigation of the past, both in the world of naturalism and in that of antiquarianism, considered complementary part of the sacred art of making history. Hamilton shared with his Italian acquaintance also the interest for a comparative study of ancient religions. The most famous result of his interest is the Cult of Priapus, written with Richard Payne Knight. As his friend, of course, Hamilton was aware of Toland's theory of Prisca Theologia and the theological and geological thesis of Priestley. On the other hand, the idea of nature as an unique, living and changing organism constantly in balance is also connected to the Neapolitan scientific environment to which the cyclical concept of the history is grafted, the result of a Masonic interpretation of Vico. That's why Toland's and Priestley's book found a very high and wide appreciation among meridional intellectuals before and independently by Hamilton himself. The concept of anima mundi knew a wide diffusion among those intellectuals until the 30s of 19th century. Anima mundi represented both the stimulus and the final goal of their researches, and in a sense of their whole existence, because to uncover the world and its changing through times meant uncover God's best kept secrets, to get closer and maybe to reach it. In this sense, they consider their studies as a theological journey and a mission in front of all of humanity. And it's very well expressed in a poem written by Antonio Ierocades for the death of Giuseppe De Botis with Breslau, one of the closest Italian collaborators of Hamilton in Naples. De Botis, as the author himself, was a Freemason and a member of Accademia Borbonica. Both of them belonged to that group of high-ranking reformist clergies that, influenced by ideas coming from beyond the Alps and fascinated by Jansenism, tried to set up a reasonable declination of God and of Catholic Church, a group mainly originated in Rome around the Nazarene. In fact, the theistic horizon and geological and archaeological investigation carried out in Rome and Naples itself is linked to the philo-Jansenist and Augustinian matrix of Nazareth, in which the idea of God as ordering wisdom that guides the event of the universe toward the ultimate and necessary is grasped. The rector, Gian Vincenzo Petrini, introduced the teaching of mineralogy and natural history, and with the help of Scipione Breslau, pianist himself, set up a magnificent mineralogical collection and a laboratory. Starting from Bacon and Priestley, Petrini forwarded a new idea of study of nature and of history that did not move men away from God, but get them closer to him, as the nature was God himself. Priestley was in particular well known to Petrini and his pupils, and these books were read and appreciated also in Naples, because mainly children of Neapolitan Enlightenment intellectual elite, inspired by Genovese, who was in contact with Petrini himself, studied at Nazareno between 1750 and 1790, some of them later part of the Hamilton entourage, as Ascanio Filomarino della Rocca or Breslau himself. The book written by those intellectuals had an unedited wide diffusion, as they were meant to be, because divulgate knowledge was believed to be a part of their mission, a mission of civilization actually. That is why by the 17th or 18th century and for nearly 30 years, the idea of God nature was really widespread and largely prevailed far outside the close circle of Hamilton and his acquaintance. Carlo Castone della Torre di Lezzonico was a collector and a art historian working at the court of Parma in the entourage of the minister Dotio. He had been in part educated in Naples and was very closely related to Nazareno. Friend and collaborators of Breslau and Hamilton, his contribution to the archaeological studies and to the text of the British diplomats is largely unknown and poorly studied. Rezzonico shared with the rest of Hamilton acquaintance the vitalistic, positive, and theistic idea of nature. In his words, we find some of the most beautiful and clear definition of it. Follower of senses and strongly influenced by Saverio Bettinelli and Frugoni, his aesthetic theories were near the ones of Condillac. This was probably one of the main reasons why Hamilton had chosen Rezzonico to write the introduction to collection of engravings. But strangely, there is no trace of such a text inside the printed book. We can only suppose that Hamilton decided to eliminate the letter of his Venetian learned friend because he was accused to be one of Cagliostro's acquaintance in Rome. For sure, it ought to be a sudden changing of mind, because in a letter by Hamilton to Rezzonico, date Caserta, 13 February 1793, the diplomat declares to appreciate very much the work of the noble Venetian and assure him that it would have represented the main part of the second volume of the book. But Rezzonico suddenly death in 1795 in Naples caused the dispersal of most of his manuscript, The comment written by Rezzonico for collection engraving is to be considered for now lost. The revolutionary event at the end of the century distracted this cohesive group of intellectuals, but interaction between them were not interrupted. When Charles Lyell first came to Naples was because he was still convinced that it was one of the best places in the world in which he could demonstrate his theories. Lyell was just the last heir and the best of this long tradition. With Gideon Mantel, Lyell is considered the father of modern gradualism. But as late as 1835, Lyell can still call Mantel a geological antiquarian. On the title page of his most important text, Principles of Geology, stands a magnificent reproduction of Macellum of Pozzuoli, which represents at once the starting point and the main proof of his theories. In the extraordinarily beautiful introduction, Lyell used the very effective image of the time that writes living signs on the planet's surface that scholars must decipher, an image that he probably borrowed from Hamilton, but that Hamilton himself had taken by the lively cultural environment of 17th century Naples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was a wonderful talk. And now we will proceed to Alain Schnapp, who is Emeritus Professor of Greek Archaeology at the Université Panthéon-Sorbonne. He's the author of The Discovery of the Past and Une Histoire Universelle des Ruines. He was co-curator of the exhibition Forme de la Ruine at Lyon. He has been a visiting professor in various European and American universities and director of the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art from 2000 to 2005. We are pleased to have you here with us, Professor Schnapp.
First of all, I will ask you to accept my apologize for my terrible accent, which is not very at ease. Hi. And thank you, Maria. Thank you, Carol. All the people who invited me to participate in this exchange. I will try to connect the history of the both city of the Vesuvius in a historical process in three parts.
You need to copy the
Yes.
mic.
I will try to follow the history of the impact of the excavation of the city of Campani in a long history, beginning with the first antiquarian excavation and going in the direction, as you heard from Maria in the few minutes, I went in the direction of a new science, which is not called antiquarianism, antiquity, but archaeology. And this is a reflection on the methodology, on the way in which society reacts. I begin with this extraordinary small portable museum, which is a private collection of a visitor of Jerusalem, who has collected all these object inscription sites as a record of his travel. So we find, you heard about medieval Greek, medieval context, but this is one of the most extraordinary pieces of heritage that I have ever heard. It's no problem.
I'm wondering if we can take it out of the stand,
Mhm.
so you don't have to bed down. Would that be better?
Thank you. The first thing we should explain the antiquarian approach is the fact that you collect objects and you reuse these objects. And I think the most extraordinary object of this kind is the Casa dei Crescenzi in Roma, which is completely elaborated.
You have to be a rock singer.
Yeah, which is completely immersed in this collection of spolia. Spolia spoliarum can be a good definition of such a house. For archaeology, so field antiquarianism, the first excavation I ever found was done in the beginning of the 16th century. And you have here the representation of the place of the excavation after some part of the discovery which are rationally described. But the main revolution in antiquarianism is the art of recording. And this is strongly connected with the Renaissance. If you look at Francesco di Giorgio Mariani, he will explain, as you say, his relationship with the past in his desire to have a sketch, a drawing of any monument in the world. And this is the beginning of the ethic of recording, which is both part of the architect experience of the 16th century and also of the 15th century, 16th century, and also of the antiquarian. And Cyriac of Ancona says that the stones themselves offer to those who observe them much more certain and reliable information about the great events of the past than what was found in books. This is the beginning of the definition of documentation, which is a central point in the Pompeii Herculaneum, and the existence of a vision which can rely on the historical dimension of the past. The Hammerbach drawings at Augst are the first public excavation paid by the council of the city of Augst. What you see, and this is the theater, the Roman theater of Augst. And it was excavated in the 16th century, and it can be the model of the discovery of the theater of Pompeii. This is a question which is connected with the first discovery. But you have to behave at an aquarium, you have to do a sketch of your discovery. But you have also to give a definition of an aquarium. And the best definition I ever found is given by John Howard, one of the biggest British antiquarians of the 17th century, who wrote his antiquity are so exceedingly old that no books don't reach them, so that there is no way to retrieve them but the comparative antiquity which I have written upon from the monuments themselves. And these phrases are really the first in the history of the West to give a strong definition of archaeology in the sense of excavation, communication, documentation. And this is one of the first excavation reports given by John O'Reilly. And this is a typological reconstruction of medieval architecture using the concept of typology, which is the major concept of archaeology, the unique way to rely the discovery to the passage of time. Another of these extraordinary documents is pyramid of memory of the beginning of the 18th century, in which you see the pyramid saying this is the past, the glorious past of the East. And you see these bases, which are medieval bases, coming from Poland and the north of Germany. And the most interesting things for me is this place here, the first figuration of shards in the history of antiquarians. If you accept the shard, you accept the relationship between the molecular existence of indices and your reconstruction. And this is a point which is very important in the political vision of Tanucci and the people of the entire cities. In a representation of the 18th century in Germany, you see also the landscape as a part of knowledge of the past, and you see the people excavating. And at the point that the book, which was published in the beginning of the 18th century, will represent the classical world and the non-classical world. And this is also a major issue. You see here the figuration of Historia, the figuration of Mercury, and so on, the cabinet, numismatic cabinet, with here.
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
Here you have the chairs, and you have the bronze axis. So this is the first figuration of the remote past of prehistory on the classical landscape that I know in the context of European culture. You heard Marina describing the way in which natural sciences and antiquarianism will be developed in Mea. And this development is parallel to the one in Brittany. Clearly, the man who has made the first major pas en avant, the first discovery of that, is Robert Hooke. Shells and fossils were the medals, dunes, or monument of nature, the greatest and most lasting monument of antiquity, which in all probability will far antedate are the most ancient monument of the world, even the pyramids. So this is a manifesto which opened the way for a prehistoric vision of the past, for a universal history in which classical past is connected with non-classical past. In the country, this comes clearly from Brittany, from Germany, country in which the limes was part of the landscape, but the romanization was not the same. The visual revolution opened a new avenue to look at the reconstruction of the past. And we should look at Camus, who was one of the first trying to give a clear definition of antiquarianism. He would only like used to see less to Basel than the strict, and to join more often the testimonies of the ancient, the path of comparison, which is for the antiquary, but observation and experiments is for the physicist. It's in a quotation of John O'Reilly. But clearly, with the diffusion of this book, the place and the concept was really expanded. One of the first to reflect about the excavation in Pompeii on the disgrace of the tunnel was the President de Brosse. The President de Brosse is not only a president, he is one of the first anthropologists in the history of the 18th century. And he, from the beginning, he would say, one will never accomplish anything very useful if one continues to work in this way, and if one does not decide to remove the earth in a considerable space from the exterior room to the ground floor of the city. And this is a major question, iterative question, which is part of the politics of the Bourbon rulers. And Maffei wrote in some years after a wonderful memorandum, a letter, in which he explained, as you say here, that the antiquarians, Alcubierre, chief architect, should absolutely find a way to an open air excavation in order to avoid any of the difficulties. But it costs more to open an open air excavation. And the tradition was connected with, you see that in the temple of Isis, which is one of the first open air excavation. But you find out also we spoke about Winkelmann. Winkelmann was clearly one of the major spirits. But look at that. He says he is not interested in an open air excavation. Why? Because he is interested in the quality in art. If you work in Pompeii, you can hardly find a sculpture like in a Greek temple. You can hardly find objects which connect the observation of the past to art history. And Winkelmann, who was a critical spirit, who critical the Bourbon, would not allow the idea to an open air excavation. But maybe you can look at another vision. You heard in the present presentation the story of William Hamilton. John Douglas was the man who introduced the book of Cook, James Cook. And look, he says the antiquarians are loving Hamilton and will discuss all his antiquities. But will not his curiosity, the antiquarian, be more awakened? Will not find even more real matter for important reflection by passing an hour in surveying the numerous specimens of our nearly discovered friends, brought from the utmost recesses of the globe. The expensive of this Cook voyage did not perhaps far exceed that of digging out the burial contents of Herculaneum. This is a kind of attack against antiquarian, which has an extraordinary political resonance. And Chateaubriand will, later, I am following a wonderful paper with Stefano Lecaro on the history of Pompeii. In his voyage of Constantinople en Italie, et aux îles de l'archipel, Chateaubriand had imagined leaving the things in the site where and how he had been found, reconstruct roof, ceilings, floors, and so creating a musée de plein air like Maffei. And some of the excavation of this time would open the way for that. And Michele Arditi will try to restructure the excavation, developing this open area approach. But this work has to open as a reflection to the practice finishing with all the degradation which are connected with the tunnel. And the important point is this famous commission, the Zucco Commission of the beginning of the 19th century, in which all the process of excavation, restoration, opening the museum are developed. So the consequence of the excavation in Pompeii or Herculaneum was to create a kind of chain of activities, from the excavation to the design, from the design to the restoration, from the restoration to the museum. And this is a complete set of knowledge. But at this moment, I was very surprised to discover, looking at the memorie de la Accademia Herculaneum, I discovered this mention, the archaeologia. Never at its formation, the society has to do with the word archaeologia. The word archaeologia, like in English archaeology, like in French archaeology, begin his career in these days. And it's extraordinary to find that one of the most traditional society will use the word to open a definition of a new way of looking at the past. Fu allora possibile che una scienza si forma denominata archeologia, la quale non come il volgo opina si pasce di chimera e di illusione, ma investiga, confronta, dilucida con la faccia della critica i monumenti. This is a general reflection of the pedagogical intellectual use of archaeology. And this is integrated in the vision of the elite of the excavation in Neapel at the beginning of the 19th century. At this time, Edouard Gerard, who was the founder of the Institut de Correspondance Archeologica, the first international society for the excavation of the classical site, Gerard will publish an essay of definition of the function of archaeology. By archaeology, so the fact that he has to do that is clearly a sign of an ideological reconstruction. By archaeology, we mean the branch of classical philology based on the monumental works and traces of ancient engineering, rather than on literary sources and objects. This is an attack against Winkelmann, against the people who were excavating only for finding objects. And second article of Gerard's presentation is connected with the use of archaeology. The task of archaeology is to present not just a selection of art monuments, but the entirety of the monumental material, both for its own sake and its consequence for literary, religious, and individual relics. The entirety of all philological research on the total worldview of ancient life. Worldview. So it's connected, the Mediterranean, the city of the Vesuvio, with a general definition that you can find in the new excavation, like in the Forum of Pompeii. But you find that in the reflection all in the world of people influenced by the discovery. And the Napoleon, Ancarville, Hamilton connection with Philip III, and the influence of Philip III in West India is very clear. Las memorias de la antigüedad son las demostraciones verídicas de lo que fueron las academias. Antonio de Ulloa was a very gifted man, but he was the governor of one of the Mexico province, and after the administrator of the French Louisiana. And he was one of these people disseminating the idea of looking at the past. And to conclude, I will share with you this extraordinary work done in the middle of the 19th century about American Indian Louisiana. In Florida, in the south, on the south, you see this vision. This is not a painting, but a mapping. And if you go further, you find the excavation with all the stratigraphic dimension of each part of the work. And you see the archaeologists, the worker, and the stratigraphic vision. And to finish, we have a kind of aerial vision which is connected with the open air excavation clearly. And no one has Goethe and his friend Tischbein were involved in the process. You have seen Tischbein's classical work. He was a man who had made this extraordinary vision of Goethe in the Roman campaign, and yet you see the excavation organized by Goethe with the help of Tischbein, and you will see one of these mounts which is stratigraphy. And if you go further in the work, Tischbein was not only a painter, but he was involved in the process of general excavation. And he produced for Goethe this protohistoric reproduction of objects found in Goethe's excavation process. So I tried to this survey to explain the inner dialectic between the different disciplines, the accomplishment of a new positivist branch of knowledge, archaeology, and the fact that it was done during all the 15 or 20 years of the second Pompeian and Herculaneum excavation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alain, and a fascinating survey of the development of archaeology. And I look at this last illustration and I think Heinrich Schliemann, very similar to his illustrations at Mycenae, for example. So let us continue to the next paper by Domenico Pino, who is the curator of prints and drawings at the Società Napoletana di Storia Patria in Naples, and a consultant for the Direzione Generale dei Musei. He's a curatorial assistant at the Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Naples. His doctorate in history of art from UCL is on printmaking in the 18th century Naples. He has held fellowships at the British Museum, the Museo e Real Bosco di Capodimonte, and the Istituto Italiano per gli Studi Storici. Welcome, Domenico. Let's see if I can. Don't forget to speak it.
Close to the microphone. Thank you very much. I would like to start by saying thank you to the organizers of this conference for having me. It's certainly a huge honor to present my research in front of and immediately after scholars I much indebted to and admire enormously. Also, the work I'm about to present is the result of conversations and debts to many people. Maria Toscano, first of all, Elena Schnapp indirectly, but also Andrea Milanese, Paolo Del Conso, Alessandro Zaccandini in Naples, and many others. But the faults and shortcomings remain, of course, my own. Many of us may be familiar with this image. It is one of the earliest, although fictitious, representations of the excavations of Herculaneum. To be sure, this is a later copy. It appeared as a plate in an early 19th century publication, but we can easily trace its genealogy back to the mid-18th century. This tiny and, let's be frank, quite crude print is after the much more refined etching used as a testatina or headpiece in Voyage Pittoresque or Description de Voyage des Naples de Sicile by the Abbé de Saint-Nom. Introducing the chapter devoted to the Vesuvian excavations and the antiquity collection then housed in the Royal Palace at Portici, the etching is by Karl Gottlieb Gutenberg after a drawing by Judah Robert. Its source can be identified with a pencil and gouache drawing today in the Goethe Museum in Düsseldorf. Because of the access restrictions to both the excavations and the Royal Museum at Portici we already discussed, and because Herculaneum was not brought to light until much later, 18th century representations of the excavations are exceedingly rare, and to my knowledge, this is the first and only one, and I stress that this is an invention, a symbolic sort of representation, rather than a view taken on site. But let's go back to our German copy. It appeared as a plate in Unterhaltungen aus der Naturgeschichte by Gottlieb Tobias Wilhelm, a sort of encyclopedia and octavo of natural history. Each volume treats a subject as varied as zoology, botany, mineralogy, and so on, and they're all illustrated by hand-colored plates, and the iconographical sources span chronological and geographical origins. The excavations of Herculaneum appear as plate 49 on the volume on mineralogy. What strikes me here is not so much that the print has been copied off a century after the appearance of its original source, that it has crossed geographical borders, or that it has been reduced in size and quality. Practices of carving and readjustments of format and technical execution in order to reach different markets are inherent to early modern printmaking from as early as the 15th century. I'm rather more interested in the fact that the representation of Herculaneum should have been removed out of and placed back in so many contexts over the course of about 50 years, so as to end up not in an antiquarian publication, but in one on natural history. Although the physical and conceptual migration of this image may suggest that the excavations on the slopes of Vesuvius were deemed a fruitful site for the study of natural history only later and far away from Naples, this is not the case. In fact, digging at Arsina, Pompeii, Sabia, etc., was fueled by not only antiquarian interests, but also geological ones, almost from the very beginning. All three versions of this image, in fact, show a party of men gesturing towards and discussing about the resurfacing antiquities, whilst behind them another group peer down into the crevices and reasons about the layers of lava. One of the most famous and one of the earliest contemporary accounts of such a combination of interests is to be found in the dedication pages by Giovanni Maria della Torre, addressed to Charles of Bourbon, prefacing the 1755 catalogue introducing the Monumento alle Antichità di Ercolano Esposte. These pages read, and I quote, "With the natural magnificence and noble genius for antiquities which reside in your royal mind, when you ordered that excavations be made in most diverse places, and among others of Herculaneum, not only a new field was opened for lovers of learning to illustrate many principal points of ancient history, but moreover, by observing the effects wrought by the first explosion of Vesuvius, most important and novel materials have been provided to natural history as well." End of quote. Although he is best known as one of the most prolific and influential writers on Vesuvius of mid-18th century Naples, Della Torre acted also as a surveyor of the royal collections at Capodimonte and as director of the Stamperia Reale, the royal press at Naples. In this passage, his experience with observing volcanic phenomena, supervising the safekeeping and display of an artwork collection, and managing the reproduction and print of the archaeological finds from Herculaneum come through beautifully intermingled. Della Torre uses the words, quote-unquote, important and novel materials, to to refer to what is observable in the tunnels of the excavations, a phrase that may apply to the archaeological finds as much as to geological samples. This passage by de la Torre has often been understood as early evidence of the rise of practices of studying and collecting geological samples from Vesuvius that were to affirm in Naples and elsewhere in the second half of the 18th century. I suggest that, writing in 1755, de la Torre was in fact alluding to practices that were already established. The objective of my paper today is analyzing how the study of antiquity and of natural phenomena, especially those of volcanic nature, were closely related in Naples from early on in the 18th century. Just as the discoveries on the slopes of Vesuvius prompted the articulation of new knowledge systems and methodologies to understand, take care of, and display antiquities, they did so also for the understanding of volcanic minerals. In fact, I argue that much the same methodology was shared across both categories of objects. My title, Simboli insieme e prove dell'istoria, or at once symbols and evidence of history, is in fact derived from a late 17th century antiquarian publication, Francesco Bianchini's La Storia Universal, provata con monumenti e figurata con simboli degli antichi. This quote sums up Bianchini's understanding of classical fragments, and with that also much of antiquarian practices of the early modern period, namely, to think of the material remains of the past, to picture entire objects, monuments, practices, and more broadly, phases of human civilization in order to reconstruct and make sense of a humanist, anthropocentric vision of history. I'd use it as a title of a paper on mineral samples, as I'm convinced that in 18th century Naples, as elsewhere, a piece of lava, a pumice stone, or indeed any type of rock from Vesuvius was understood in much the same way, as both evidence of geological processes and as symbols of discourses on not only the functioning of volcanoes, but also the history of the earth, its great age, the complex and often cruel processes of nature, and the dwarfed position that men and women occupied in an increasingly expanded time frame. Giovanni Maria della Torre was in no way an isolated figure in being moved by so many and so varied interests. Equally varied fans of professional appointments and private curiosities were shared by many figures gravitating around the Bourbon court, from the Prime Minister Bernardo Tanucci to the economist, diplomat and collector Ferdinando Valiani, to mention just some of the most notable. Among them was also Camillo Paderni. Paderni arrived in Naples in the early 1750s in the capacity of surveyor, not of the excavations, but of the antiquity collection that was steadily being accumulated at Portici. He seems to have taken an interest in Vesuvius from early on, observing and documenting its eruptions and climbing the mountain several times. As for others, also for him, the study of antiquity and that of volcanoes were closely related and mutually informative. Enlightening evidence of his approach is to be found in one of his manuscripts. After Charles of Bourbon left Naples for Spain in 1759, Paderni started drafting a diary for him, recording the most notable discoveries from Herculaneum and Pompeii, and describing the progress of the excavations in general. In this diary, Paderni records, for example, the discovery of much of the bronze and marble sculptures from the Villa dei Pavili, as well as of much of the papyrus scrolls. In a long passage of this manuscript, Paderni puts forward a theory on the famous eruption of 79 AD, what kind of eruption it might have been, and what form it might have taken, providing a sketch of his own invention. He writes, and I quote, and it's a rather long quote, so please bear with me, I have never believed it possible that such a disaster at Pompeii could have happened suddenly, and without any signs in the preceding days, as occurred in that horrible last eruption of the year 1767. If it had been otherwise in Pompeii, they would not have neglected to abandon the place, and if, in order to save their lives, they had not cared about their belongings, why then do we still find so many dead bodies continuously? I, having been a spectator of many eruptions, and having observed that they were not all alike, sometimes even having had the curiosity to go observe near the mountain, was able in particular to understand what happened to Pompeii. Thus, I formed my opinion, and I say that the ground opened not far between Pompeii and Stabia, whence was vomited such a quantity of pumice stones and ashes that not only did they cover Pompeii, but also the city of Sabia. But since I first wished to establish the point that the chasm did not open far from those two cities, I prove it by the size of the stones themselves, having measured some 1.5 feet in length, which is about this size, which consequently the air or wind could not have carried far away, as happens with the ashes of the mount. So Paderni elaborates his theory on a past eruption, departing not only from the observation of eruptions contemporary with him, but also from the study of specific pieces of volcanic matter, the large pumice stones. What is more, he departs from these observations to modify, readjust, and direct the excavations of Pompeii, or at least to make wandering suggestions. He continues, if we wish to establish this eruption as I have imagined it, we must agree that in the quarter where first they suffered the load of the stones, I believe no one could have survived, and consequently they remained buried there with their furnishing and treasures. When one day those royal excavations shall reach that site, still unknown to us, I believe that the things discovered there will alone be able to form another great museum, no less rich than the present one. If we grant such a declivity, as I have expressed in the drawing, we shall at once see that those who lived on the opposite side of the city were more able than any others to save themselves, and consequently had ample time to put their goods in safety. Hence, it will no longer be a wonder that we have discovered countless noble and private houses without finding in them a single nail. End of quote. So in this most interesting passage, often ignored by pure archaeologists or pure art historians, we find a very explicit and conscious reference to the fact that the mineral specimens were in fact treated as classical fragments, in the sense that they were used to reconstruct specific events of classical history. Paderni's manuscripts is interesting also for his use of drawing as a tool, an argumentative tool, to unpack and make intelligible to his readers that evidentiary and symbolic value he attributed to the pumice stones encountered at Pompeii. In this passage, and the accompanying drawing, if this passage and the accompanying drawing make clear the symbolic value with which volcanic specimens were charged in the context of the excavations at Naples, it is no wonder that they soon began to be highly desirable collectibles. The quotes analyzed so far all point to the fact that as the study of natural history on the slopes of Vesuvius was receiving increasing attention following the discovery of Herculaneum and Pompeii, so was also the practice of collecting rocks from the volcano. The literature on this topic invariably dates this collecting craze to the 1770s, but I suggest that the practice dates back to the 1740s and 50s in Naples, if not earlier. The 1770s is merely the decade when such a practice became fashionable, regulated by better defined rules in terms of both taste and inquisitive rigor, and market trends can be better reconstructed through sale catalogs. In fact, the aforementioned Ferdinando Galliani had put together a collection of mineral specimens from Vesuvius, organized it in 6 boxes, and presented it to Pope Benedict XIV already in the early 1750s, so between 52 and 53, I believe. With his usual verve, Galliani had one of the boxes engraved with the inscription Beatissime Pater, fac ut lapides isti pane fiant, or Most Holy Father, do so as these rocks be transformed into bread, referencing that passage of the Gospel in which Jesus is tempted by Satan in the desert. The joke must not have gone lost on the Pope, who returned Galliani's present with a religious appointment with a related yearly revenue of 400 ducats. This humorous instance proves not only that volcanic specimens were collected and exchanged already in the 1750s, but also that an extensive and good quality collection, such as the one assembled by Galliani, must have been considered valuable enough not only to be presented to a pontiff, but also to be exchanged for political and economic favors. It is true, nonetheless, that if we have hints of the existence of such geological collections in Naples from at least the 1750s, we have representations and detailed descriptions of them only from the 1770s onwards. To my knowledge, one of the earliest representations of such collections is to be found independent of paintings by Pietro Fabris representing the interior of Kenneth Mackenzie Earl Seaforth apartment in Naples of 1771. So this is one and that's the other. The paintings show two sides of the same room. In one, we see a fencing lesson, and we can identify Mackenzie at center, whilst in the other, we see a concert in which take part no less than Leopold and the young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, at the harpsichord and spinetta respectively, and William Hamilton and Brown playing the violin. The two paintings are extremely interesting for a variety of reasons, but for our purposes we shall limit ourselves to mentioning the objects on the shelves in both pictures, among which we can recognize what look like volcanic specimens. A group is displayed below one picture of the area around Pozzuoli, whilst the other is presented in proximity of antiquities, red and black figure vases, and small bronzes. The way in which geological inquiries on Vesuvius and the area of the so-called Phlegraean fields informed landscape painting, especially in gouache, in Naples, is a complex and fascinating topic that will require a long study on its own. But the presentation of samples from Vesuvius next to antiquities seems to show that the mutually enlightening relationship between antiquities and volcanoes was reproduced in display settings in domestic spaces, although aristocratic and erudite ones. Fabris's paintings of Lord Mackenzie's apartment are, to be sure, indicative of taste and practices not of Neapolitans, but of foreigners living in Naples, especially English and Scottish. Evidence scattered here and there, however, would suggest that Neapolitan interiors might have looked not too different from those recorded by Fabris, or at least that antiquarian and geological collections might have been assembled and displayed with similar relationships at play. Ferdinando Galliani drafted a catalogue of the mineral collection he had presented to the Pope and published it in 1772, by which date its Vesuvian specimens had entered the collection of the University of Bologna. A few years later, in 1770, so here you get the catalogue and the manuscript version, the manuscript draft. A few years later, in 1779, he drafted the manuscript catalogue also of a collection of ancient vases from Campania and Apulia in order to offer them for sale to the King of Sweden. Whether Galliani owned those two collections, so the mineralogical and the archaeological ones, and whether he had them displayed in his own house, or whether he simply put them together in order to exchange them for financial gain, is an issue that remains to be explored. But I believe that his close involvement in describing and dealing in such collections is nonetheless indicative of the fact that the relationship between antiquities and volcanic specimens was not an invention of foreigners, it was rooted in Neapolitan discourses. In 1772, as Galliani published his catalogue of Vesuvian minerals, Domenico Tata published a catalogue of Sicilian minerals, many of which of volcanic origin. William Hamilton, as is known to all of you, I'm sure, published his Campi Flegrei in 1776, dedicating 13 of its 54 plates to the illustration of mineral specimens. Plate 49 and 50 are most interesting as they show rocks of Vesuvius not as found in nature, but as cut, polished, and organized in a sample case. In the accompanying text, Hamilton refers to the fact that these plates reproduce a mineral collection like those that travelers and locals alike could acquire, already assembled and already framed, in the shop of Tommaso and Mattia Valenziani in Naples in front of the Royal Theatre. The fact that Hamilton is referring to such a specific product in a specific shop suggests that by the mid-1770s, geological samples must have been in such high demand in Naples that a particular dealer was offering beautifully packaged products catering to a very specific taste. To help his customers in making an informed purchase, in 1784, Mattia Valenziani published an index of all the materials produced by Vesuvius, explaining the geological processes resulting in each formation in what is at the same time a sale catalogue and a synthetic guide to volcanic and natural history. If Hamilton clearly references Valenziani's sample cases as the source for his plates, I suggest that these prints present visual and conceptual affinities also with some of the plates from Giovanni Battista Piranesi's Antiquità di Roma of 1756, a copy of which Hamilton in fact owned. In these two plates in particular, both kinds of rocks, volcanic specimens and Roman epigraphs, are understood as material remains bearing the physical inscriptions of earlier phases of Istria. But the Valencianis did not offer only mineralogical collections systematically assembled and effectively displayed. They also offered pieces of decorative art made with stones from Vesuvius, including snuff boxes, candelabra, and more famously, tabletops. And this is another example which I like a lot better. So just as we witnessed the creation of famous and important mineralogical collections in Naples and elsewhere, built and organized with scientific and didactic intents, such as those of Galliani, Fortrose, and Montantata, but we could mention again those of Ascanio Filomarino in Naples, Giuseppe Gioveni in Molfetta, and the Prince of Biscay in Catania. We also witnessed the spread of matter from Vesuvius in the polite spaces of sociability. In addition to his own geological collection, for example, Hamilton had 2 tables made of volcanic specimens, which he acquired from a certain Felice Orlando in 1770 for 80 ducats. So Maria probably located the tables, but we didn't find pictures, and I'm showing this as a contemporary example, which might have been made in Sicily rather than Naples, but probably this is what they look like. These tables most probably reference the tables made in Rome with pietre dure and pieces of ancient colored marble. So formally they invoke once again archaeological classicizing discourses. But their meaning was different. In them, slabs of volcanic minerals must have acted as a synergy. A piece was standing for the whole, and their interests must have been at the same time decorative, documentary, ostentatious, and argumentative. This conceptual charge of individual pieces of volcanic matter is made explicit in some later sample tabletops, where we find representations of Vesuvius with the very materials produced by the mountain. A solution which I find a little too indexical and which risks taking away some of the poetic value of the implicit reference. A much more effective way of displaying geological samples in late 18th century Naples is offered by a passage of Lettre sur l'éducation des princesses of 1791 by Julie de Murrschbach, Duchess di Giovanni, and lady-in-waiting to Queen Maria Carolina of Naples. Among other things, the book instructs young women of noble birth on how to educate themselves and their children, and encourages its readers to display geological samples, des objets de l'histoire naturelle, next to prints de belle vue, that may, quote-unquote, entertain and stimulate one to reconcile, as said before, the part with the whole. And this is more or less the same display setting we found in Lord Forter's apartment in Naples. But just as the discoveries of Herculaneum and Pompeii became a central element for the articulation of the identity of the Bourbon monarchy, and as Vesuvius and ancient vases became a characterizing element of Neapolitan intellectual and financial speculation, volcanic specimens and their integration into the decorative arts became equally representative of local artistic production. In 1790, the royal sculptor Francesco Palmekönig is documented to have realized 2, but maybe more, vases in pietre del Vesuvio, or rocks from Vesuvius, for the royal manufactory of pietre dure at Naples, which, however, at present have not been able to identify. To move into the early 19th century, the Neapolitan manufacturers of ceramics experimented with clays made from volcanic earth, the most extraordinary example being the pair of large terraglia vases by the manufactory of the Del Vecchio brothers, today at the Museo di Capodimonte, combining at once volcanic matter, the shape of Greek vases, and Roman antiquities, with the handles in the shape of the Farnese Hercules. Arguing that these vases clearly reference geological theories might be a stretch, but it is beyond doubt that the juxtaposition of their materiality and iconography is suggestive of a relationship between volcanoes and antiquities, not to mention that the fact that they were clearly presented as a demonstration, not to mention that they were, and we know this from the sale catalogs, were clearly presented as a demonstration that Vesuvius could be understood as a generative presence for local economy. I close with this image. It is a page from an early 19th century album Amicorum, assembled in England by an anonymous female collector. Views of Naples and classical prints abound in its pages. This leaf presents the juxtaposition of the view of the soldiers' barracks at Pompeii with the large 18th century barracks built by the Bourbons at Naples near the Ponte della Maddalena. There seems to be implied a comparison, maybe even a continuity, between past and present, and Mount Vesuvius in eruption seems to be placed at center to work as the linking element. We think of our present in relationship to the past through a volcanic eruption. And I wonder, who of us has never thought of their own library in relationship to the Villa dei Papiri? Or who has never wondered of what archaeologists of the future may infer of our society by finding our books, furniture, daily objects, or the pictures we keep on our walls? And I'm not comparing Herculaneum the point of reference for all these speculations. If the impact of the discovery of Herculaneum at Pompeii on the artistic and intellectual production of the 18th century and early 19th century has long been addressed, focusing on the dissemination of the figures and iconographies found in the resurfacing frescoes, dancing Menads, Lamarck and Lamour, and so on and so forth, I hope to have demonstrated that an equally important and fortunate impact of the discoveries was the collecting of volcanic specimens and their integration in contemporary interiors in the form of either organized collections or pieces of decorative art, where they were charged with symbolic values pointing to a historical consciousness. Matter from Vesuvius was used to think of the past and the present alike, and more in general, of the precarious position of human life in an expanded time frame dating back to well before the antiquity and pointing to the possibility of a faraway future. Being the source of much of these materials, Herculaneum was the site where men and women were confronted with such a historical consciousness. The print we opened with, thus, was probably included in a natural history encyclopedia of the 1820s to function just as an sample tabletops of the Duchess de Jovenes Prince of Bellevue, to reconcile the part with the whole. But by the whole, I mean not only the place of origin of particular specimens, but the constellation of thoughts associated with an ancient city destroyed and preserved at the same time by the volcanic eruption, just as Herculaneum. This symbolic, almost poetic element, which I argue was intrinsic to the discovery of Herculaneum from the early decades, and was enhanced in the Romantic period, seems to have been forgotten in the drastic division between the humanities and the sciences of the modern era. Thank you.